Hello everybody, I'm Chris. I'd like to welcome you back to the series that I'm doing called Analyzing Literature. And today we're going to be looking at a new concept, and in reality several new concepts, relating to literary terms and devices. So the last time that we did a segment of this series, we talked about the differences and similarities between analysis and critique. And I mentioned that when people are writing analytical essays, there's a certain style and a certain format that goes along with these analytical style essays, which is quite different from what the expectations are in a critique. So the reason why we're talking about analyzing literature and analyzing how different literary devices and terms today is because these types of analytical essay prompts commonly appear on standardized testing. So we did an example of an MCAS open response for the long essay section of the MCAS test for the grade 10, where we talked about character influences and characters' motivations. And I did a long example of how to break down a story. In the case I used was the story A Job for Valentin, and the main character of Teresa and how she is influenced by her friends and other people in that particular story. So it is also useful to know these terms and these particular items when you are in a high school situation and you are actually taking the MCAS exam. These types of expressions and these types of words and these types of literary devices often appear on questions in the multiple choice section of a test such as the MCAS. So it just so happens that I have here in my hand a copy of the MCAS Language Arts test for grade 10 from 2018. So as we know, the 2019 test was computer-based, so I don't have access to those questions, but I do have the printout for the 2018 ELA MCAS. And going through the data every year as we do, and we look at the types of questions that are commonly missed by students across the state. So we compare the results of the test for our particular school's students and see how our school performed against the state as a whole. But that is not my purpose here right now. My purpose is to point out certain questions on the test, that this particular test, 2018, that a lot of students across the state had trouble with. So we're looking at questions that basically 60%, somewhere in the 60% range, or even lower, high 50% range, that students across the state got correct. Okay? So let me put that another way. In my school where I work, there's about 400 sophomores, 450 sophomores who take the MCAS Language Arts in grade 10. And all students across the state of Massachusetts take the MCAS in grade 10 on the same days. So you can imagine how many students across the entire state. We have about 350 towns in Massachusetts. Every one of those basically has a high school. You can imagine, 120, 200 students, in my case 400 students to 450 students, all take the MCAS on the same day. That's going to provide a very large sample size. So somewhere in the neighborhoods of thousands of students taking the test on the same day. So based on that large number of results, we can see patterns on what kinds of questions students generally get correct and what types of questions students generally struggle with. So I'm not going to go through every single question, but I would just like to point out that on this particular MCAS exam, there was a particular section of the test, questions 19 through 26, which caused students a lot of difficulty. And unsurprisingly, these questions revolve around analysis of two excerpts from works of literature. One work of literature is George Orwell's 1984, and the other work was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. So students were required to read excerpts from these two stories, and these excerpts were approximately 2 pages long. And then the questions that followed, the multiple choice questions that followed, revolved around a comparison and contrast between these two works of literature. So it is also my guess that students were unfamiliar with these two works before they actually saw them on this MCAS exam. because 1984 is not commonly studied in high schools across the state, as far as I know, and neither is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. There would be probably a higher chance that The Jungle would be something studied in a social studies class as part of the era of the early 20th century in Chicago and the meatpacking industry and all of that, rather than in a literary situation in the English language arts class, for example. So my guess is that students were unfamiliar with these two texts going in. And then put on top of that, the comparison contrast questions is more higher level skills than just analyzing details from the actual text themselves. So, for example, out of these questions, there was a range between 69% of the students in Massachusetts getting it correct, down to 57% of students in Massachusetts getting the questions correct. So we're looking at about 40% of students across the state who got the questions wrong, or even upwards of close to 50% of students across the state got these questions wrong. So one of the questions was a basic vocabulary question. So if it's an unfamiliar word, I understand you're going to take a guess at the meaning. The word that was a problematic word in this case was the word vista, okay, which may have been an unfamiliar word because it does in fact have a meaning of a scene or a view that you're looking out from someplace and you can see a wide view from there. Like on the top of a mountain, for example, you would have a wide panoramic vista of the entire horizon. So the word vista itself, if you didn't know it, you could have looked in the paragraph for a context clue perhaps, but mostly I assume people guessed at that. But as a matter of fact, 57% of the students in Massachusetts got that question wrong. So one of the things I want to look at here is actually the open response question that deals with these two excerpts, 1984 and The Jungle. So I'm not going to focus on that particular vocabulary word because you either know it or you don't, and who knows what vocabulary term is going to appear on the test. But you can bank on the fact that these terms that we're going to look at in a moment will appear somewhere on the test, and in fact it does appear on this test. So let's look at question number 27, which was one of the 4 open response questions. So let me turn to that. I'm actually going to read question number 27 because I think it's important to hear how these questions can appear and how they are worded on these types of tests. So again, this is a comparison contrast kind of situation between the excerpt from 1984 and the excerpt from The Jungle. So question number 27 says, based on the excerpts, explain how the descriptions of the setting in both 1984 and The Jungle create mood. Support your answer with relevant and specific details from both excerpts. All right, so again, we're looking at comparison contrast here. And comparison contrast, in this case, of settings and how the settings are described and how the descriptions of these settings contribute to the establishment of the mood of the story. So obviously, again, you don't have the whole story in front of you. And if you've never read the story before and you don't know all the details of the story, you're going to have a more difficult time accessing this question just from the 2-page excerpt that you're given. And on top of that, if you're unfamiliar with what the word mood refers to in a story, that's going to make it 10 times harder to figure out what to write about. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually go over to the board and describe what mood refers to in a story. So if we look over here, the first word up here is the word mood. So what I'm going to do is define the word mood as feelings generated around a particular setting in a story. So how does an author create feelings, or how does the author generate feelings in the reader about a particular setting? So as we said way back at the beginning of this series, the setting is where the story takes place. And there could be multiple settings in a story. Obviously not just one setting is consistent with all stories. So multiple settings can be found in stories. But in this particular case, in general, we're talking about how does an author create feelings about a particular setting? So the setting could also be a relation to a historical time period, past tense, for example, past time. So if you're talking about a story that takes place during the Wild West days of the frontiers and these flash towns down there in the western part of the United States, you know, the gold rush towns that are now ghost towns, but, you know, Wyatt Earp, shootout at the OK Corral and all this kind of thing, that kind of setting is going to be completely different than a setting that takes place on the moors of southwest England, where you have a lot of, you know, things like these gothic romantic tales taking place, you know, Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights, all of this kind of thing. So how does the author do that? So I like to use the word atmosphere in connection with the word mood. So a mood is a kind of atmosphere that surrounds and envelops a particular setting. So how to describe the atmosphere of the setting is more or less describing the mood. So you can do this in a variety of ways. You can look at descriptive adjectives. So on the board, I have a number of adjectives that I have put up here that could be used to describe and talk about different types of moods related to particular settings. So is the setting sad or gloomy or depressing? So when you talk about a story like The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, sad, gloomy, and depressing, these are all feelings generated through the narrator's experience, but also by extension to the reader, around that setting of Usher's house. And all of the mood of Usher himself as a character is defined by sadness, gloominess, and depression. So the entire story is saturated with these feelings of sadness, gloominess, and depression. In the characters, in the house, in the setting, even in the front of the house where there's this black pool of water. So, is the atmosphere something happy, upbeat, positive? Okay? We don't always have to have gloomy settings. They're associated with particular types of stories. But happy, upbeat, positive feelings around a setting are certainly possible. In suspense stories, are there atmospheres threatening in any way? Are they sinister? Are they dark? So a lot of these gothic horror stories, Frankenstein, for example, the settings are threatening, sinister, dark. They could be bright, cheerful, and pleasant. Okay, again, not every story has to take place in a dark, gloomy castle. You know, Dracula does, but not every story is based on the same kind of feelings. So there could be an atmosphere of brightness, cheerfulness, pleasantness, calm, tranquil, and peaceful. So you have to think about how the author is presenting the feelings through the characters about the setting, and how the description of the setting itself contributes to the feelings that we have as readers as we go through these stories. So talking about 1984, for example, definitely the atmosphere created by George Orwell in 1984 is threatening, sinister, and dark, because you have all these references to these cold and sterile and, you know, empty streets and buildings, very sort of sanitized atmosphere, and everything is under the curtain of this leader, Big Brother, and you have this whole thing, Big Brother is watching you and all that, and even your thoughts can be revealed and become, you know, known to the government. So there are such things in that story called thought crimes, for example, where the government actually punishes people for having bad thoughts about the government and this kind of thing. So threatening, sinister, and dark for sure in a story like 1984. In a story like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which takes place in Chicago, in that area of the Chicago meatpacking plants, you know, the immigrants are the central characters in that story. But what kind of life do they have? The streets, the apartments, the tenements where they live, dark, dirty, disgusting, animals running around like rats and mice. In the factories where they work, you know, all kinds of refuse all over the place. Things winding up in the sausages, in the meats that they pack in those plants that you would never think would be humanly possible to eat, end up in those things. and it's totally unsanitary, and their lives are full of this dirtiness and this whole oppressive atmosphere of having to work like a slave in these factories in order to survive, with no rights and with no opportunities for any kind of human consideration or humane consideration. And if you can't work, if you get injured, if you fall into the vats, and die, you're done. So they'll just bring in somebody else to replace you. You have no rights, you have no benefits, you have no considerations whatsoever as a worker. Then you can work 10, 12, 14 hours a day in these very unsafe and unsanitary environments. So definitely sad, gloomy, and depressing to think about this type of atmosphere in a work like the jungle. So that is one way that you can talk about setting and mood and the connection between those. Now, another question on the test, question 32, introduces some other options for multiple choice answers related to literary terms and devices. So we have something like foreshadowing, personification, we have onomatopoeia, hyperbole, simile, and metaphor. So we're just going to run through these briefly because they often appear on tests, but they also are often covered in English language arts classes. So let me just run through a couple of examples here. So foreshadowing, as it is on this question, number 32, one of the multiple choice questions, answers as is onomatopoeia, and simile also appears as an answer choice. So I'm just going to add a couple more here. So foreshadowing refers to hints or clues given by the author in a work that indicate something to come. So we talked about the story, The Monkey's Paw, by W.W. Jacobs in a previous installment of this series. That has a lot of instances of foreshadowing in it, where we have warning after warning after warning by the sergeant major who comes and is visiting with Mr. White, and he's the one who gives Mr. White the monkey's paw. But all of the time he's warning Mr. White of the consequences of using the monkey's paw. So that story contains a lot of examples of foreshadowing. All right, let's look over here, onomatopoeia. Very simply, onomatopoeia is defined as a word that represents a sound. So for example, boom, bang, crash, these types of words that represent a noise or a sound. If you think about the sound that a cat makes, meow, would be an example of an onomatopoeia. Very commonly used in literature and also in poetry. All right? Personification, giving human qualities to non-human or non-living things. So for example, if you said, the wind was howling last night. Well, howling would be an personification, because you're giving the opportunity for the wind to make a noise or to shout in such a way that only a human could do. Or if you said, the sun raced through the sky. Well, the sun does not race. People race. So that is an example of personification. All right? Hyperbole, an exaggeration used to produce an effect. So how are you going to think about hyperbole? Well, if you said, for example, we had to buy a ton of textbooks for our English literature class, that is an example of a hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. All right? You're not literally buying 2,000 pounds worth of texts, right, for a class. You might have like 10 pounds, 20 pounds in, certain cases where the textbook is like 3 inches thick, but you're not going to have 2,000 pounds worth of textbooks. So if you said, I had to buy a ton, or I had to spend a ton of money, these are examples of hyperbole. You're exaggerating. So another example of a hyperbole would be something like an expression, I was so surprised that you could have knocked me over with a feather. Okay? This is again a hyperbole because you are exaggerating for effect. So what effect are you trying to produce here? Your extreme surprise. You're trying to emphasize how surprised you were. So that if somebody actually literally came up and touched you with a feather, you would fall over. All right? That is, a literal translation, but you can't really think of these things as literal meanings. They're more what we call figurative language. So, simile and metaphor, so commonly studied, it's so well known, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but just for the sake of definition, simile is a comparison using the words like or as, metaphor a comparison without using like or as. Okay? So if I said, for example, the rattlesnake's fangs were 2 sharp needles sticking into his skin, this would be an example of a metaphor, because I'm comparing the snake's fangs, in this case the rattlesnake's fangs, to what? To two sharp needles. But I'm not using the words like or as. So a lot of times the metaphors use what are called linking verbs. Am, is, are, was, were. So the rattlesnake's fangs were two sharp needles poking into his skin or sticking into his skin, is an example of a metaphor. All right? Very common similes would be like cold as ice, for example. So cold as ice, or another example I could give you would be if you think about eating raw octopus. A lot of people compare eating octopus to an experience like trying to chew on your pencil eraser. So if you said something like, eating raw octopus was like eating cold, rubbery pencil erasers, that would be an example of a simile. You're comparing the experience of eating the raw octopus, with eating the rubber pencil eraser. So was like, there's your simile. All right? So these are very common types of literary devices that show up in these multiple choice questions. Now, one other thing I want to bring to your attention about this particular MCAS test is the last section of the test where people had some difficulties. And again, it's understandable why they would have difficulties with this particular part of the test, because it happens to come from one of these books of epic poetry. So in a previous installment of this series, I talked about different types of heroes in terms of how heroes are classified. And one of the heroes that I mentioned, one of the heroic types of protagonists, was the epic hero. So the epic hero or the mythological hero. And in the example I used Odysseus from Homer's Odyssey as an example of a mythic or epic hero. Well, guess what? The epic or mythical hero appears on the MCAS test in this particular case from 2018. The last section of the language arts reading section is actually an excerpt from the Epic of Gilgamesh. So if you're thinking to yourself, who the hell is Gilgamesh? I never heard of such a person. Well, don't be surprised, because I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard of who Gilgamesh is. So, as a matter of fact, however, the Epic of Gilgamesh is something that has just started to be introduced into high schools. And in my case, at my school, I know some of the 10th graders are reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's hard to decide, which one they complain about most, whether it's the Odyssey or Beowulf or Gilgamesh. But in any case, Gilgamesh is an example of an epic poem with an epic hero. Gilgamesh himself is an epic hero. So there is like 4 pages of excerpt from the Epic of Gilgamesh here, but I just want to bring to your attention 2 questions that follow out of the multiple choice questions. Question number 37 says, based on lines 1 through 8, what is Gilgamesh's purpose? So I'm not going to go back and read lines 1 through 8, but my purpose here is to talk about the type of question that's being asked here. What type of question is being asked? Gilgamesh's purpose. Well, this goes back to our discussion about character motivation and why characters do what they do in literature. So in a previous installment, we talked about this in great detail. What does the character want to do? What does the character want to accomplish? What does the character want to achieve? What is their goal? What is their mission? If you ask about a character's purpose, it's the same question. What does the character want to do? What is his goal? What is his mission? So the choices here, A, B, C, D, to avenge his friend, to discover the secret of eternal life, to seek a prediction, to conquer the grief of losing a friend to death. All of these things describe motivation. Now, question 40. Again, related to setting and mood. So, listen to question 40. It says, what does the description of the garden in lines 91 through 99 mainly emphasize? So here's a question, again, related to setting and mood. And setting and mood are, in fact, connected. So if you're asked to consider this question, what does the description of the garden emphasize? Well, you're talking about mood. So the great surprise, the extreme wealth, the splendor, the loyalty, all of these answers relate to how the description relates to mood. So, these terms are only some of the more common terms found on these types of questions on standardized tests such as the MCAS. So, we will talk about a few more examples of these literary terms and devices in a future episode of this series. So, what we're going to do is we're going to pause here, and then the next time we are recording, we'll get into more of these literary terms and devices. So that's about all for now. Hopefully this was instructive and useful, and we'll see you again very soon.